So social anxiety is a fear of judgment or embarrassment uh, in in socially in front of. Sometimes it can be peers, sometimes it's strangers, sometimes it's family members. It can be anyone, and it's a difficulty tolerating the sensations that come along with embarrassment. The sense of it being embarrassed. What we usually do to treat that, like we do with any anxiety disorder, is we talk to the person about two things. One, what they're avoiding. So what kind of situations they're just flat out avoiding because they are scared of them or because they're worried they're going to make them uncomfortable. And the second is when they do force themselves to go into those sort of situations, what are the what we call safety behaviors or things that they do in those situations to help them feel more comfortable, but in effect avoid some of the feelings when they're in the situation. So things like not making eye contact, always staying with a safety person. So we come up with a list of the things that they're doing to avoid those feelings and situations, and then we help people confront them slowly, starting with things they think might be the least provoking of anxiety for them, and then working up what we call the hierarchy. Would you add anything to that, Maggie?
No, I think that's a wonderful description. Can you say more about some examples? Especially, I have some ideas about what some examples at different parts in the hierarchy, but do you want to start with, the lowest, like the first type of exposure you might do?
Right. So if someone is extremely anxious, we might actually start with imagining, being not actually exposing oneself to social situations, but just imagining a social situation that goes well. And we move from there all the way up to intentionally putting yourself in a social situation where you're going to embarrass yourself, and learning to tolerate that sort of embarrassment. And of course, there's lots of steps in between. Walking down the street and smiling at strangers. Walking down the street sometimes alone. Sometimes walking down the street with someone first. What would you add, Maggie?
Yeah, and I was just going to say, given that we're social creatures, there are some people that are able to completely avoid social interaction because they can stay at home and maybe work from home or something like this. But most of us are interacting with people all the time. And so what I find in people that are suffering from really severe social anxiety is they're maybe actually doing the situation, but they've got safety behaviors around it. So for instance, wearing sunglasses, regardless of whether or not it's sunny, while walking down the street can be a safety behavior so that you're not making eye contact with other people. Also, maybe showing up to a class or a social experience, but never saying anything. Never raising your hand, never contributing to the conversation. That would also be a safety behavior that a person that's suffering from a lot of social anxiety might be experiencing. And what I want to comment on what you're describing is, rather than kind of like going to the scariest thing you can think of, like a class where you raise your hand or a social situation where you contribute your opinion, we often start with helping you tolerate the feeling first. Mm-hmm. So something like doing something embarrassing on your porch, or counting money incorrectly at the grocery store, can trigger the feeling of embarrassment and be an amount of embarrassment that's easier to tolerate, rather than it occurring in a time where there might actually be social consequence. Like if you do something that you perceive as embarrassing and then you become very embarrassed in front of your friends, you might have trouble going back to that situation again. Mm-hmm. And we would consider that to be like too high on mm-hmm. your hierarchy. So we try to help you find things that trigger embarrassment enough to practice. And then once you're used to practicing, then you can bring that practice into everyday life. Mm-hmm. Do you have thoughts about that?
No, I'm just thinking people might be wondering why we're talking about social anxiety right now when all we're doing is social distancing. And I think that's the reason we're talking about it, because as Maggie talks about so eloquently in her blogs and in her podcast, social anxiety is about a sensitization, or anxiety disorders in general is about getting sensitized to certain types of situations or stimulus that can provoke anxiety. And what Maggie and I have been talking about is how concerns or thoughts about how social distancing specifically could set people up to be resensitized, particularly people who have been working very hard on their social anxiety. And we've been thinking about creative ways for people to continue working on their social anxiety during this time, so that when we get to the end of this period, they will have resensitized the least amount possible. Not that there won't be any resensitization, but that ways people can keep it as low as possible.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. And so we've already mentioned a couple different things, including things like just walking down the street and maybe doing something embarrassing. I think some other ideas that I've heard from people, that especially if they're not just needing to trigger embarrassment, but they're needing to trigger vulnerability on purpose, is all the different kind of friend group chats or group chat, video chats with family members, and then also even virtual dating. So a lot of people I'm hearing are taking connections that they're making through text in dating apps and going straight to video as their first date with that person. And I just think that that's wonderful, because it's actually really great for social anxiety, and that you can specifically focus on, it's easier to focus on what you want to talk about when you know there aren't any other environmental factors happening that might be distracting. I think the emotional intimacy, it's easier to make an emotional or to convey emotional intimacy when there isn't a pressure of physical intimacy. So people can actually get to know each other, and the intentions are clear that the conversation is about getting to know each other, not what's going to happen afterwards. And then the other thing that I've noticed, or I've heard people talk about, is you can really see someone's affect. So as they're talking, you can also see their facial expression, again, without anything else getting in the way. And that can be like a different type of vulnerability that really helps you get to know someone.
So not only is video dating, an opportunity to challenge your social anxiety, but there might actually be positive benefits to doing it, especially at the beginning of a relationship.
Yeah, in my group program, so in Huddle, which is what I do full time, I had initially wondered whether or not telehealth and video chat was going to be as effective as in-person groups, because the primary platform is groups. And I actually find that being able to look at everybody at the same time seems to be helpful. Seems like the real emphasis on what your face is looking like while you're talking without any other factors can really help people connect to one another. And I just assume that it also happens in friendship and in dating.
Yeah. I've heard some other creative ideas for social anxiety exposures during social distancing. One you already mentioned, which is going on your porch or in front of a window, and either doing something you're comfortable doing, but with the possibility that someone could watch, or doing something silly. I do know someone who was working on his social anxiety, and he got a phone book, and he would randomly go through the phone book, dial numbers, and challenge himself to see how long he could keep people on the phone, how long he could engage in a conversation. There is an app called Wakey that allows for free 20-minute conversations with people all over the world, and they post what they want to talk about, and then you can elect to speak to them or not. Other things I've heard are driving to places that there may be people in their cars that you can see, or just people on the road, going for a walk outside in places where that's still okay, and making eye contact with people, or if you are working at a higher level on your hierarchy, saying silly things or doing silly things or walking in silly ways. What other ideas? What am I missing?
I I think that's a really good list. I think that the only other thing that I want to offer is that you're looking at both distress tolerance goals and functional goals. So if it seemed confusing of what we're arriving at of what to do, just keep in mind that there's two different functions to any exposure. Sometimes it's to build the stress tolerance to the uncomfortable feeling that's causing avoidance. So in the case of social anxiety, the uncomfortable feeling is embarrassment. So anything you can do to trigger embarrassment and then hang out with it without avoiding and without self-criticism is great for your tolerance over time. And then the theory is that as you build that tolerance, then you're going to be able to do more and more things that potentially trigger that feeling, and you won't feel that feeling as sensitively when it's not a threat to you. So that's a distress tolerance goal. And I think a lot of what Jen is describing is distress tolerance goals. And then there's also functional goals, like I want to get a partner. And so I think some of the examples I was using are like, this isn't a time where you're going to have to go, if you were already working on getting into more friendships and getting into a dating relationship as part of a social anxiety functional goal, then I just don't think this is a time where you have to slow down. There's just more creative ways that you can work on making friends and work on dating.
Yeah. No, I was thinking one of the things I wanted to mention is that for parents of teens or children, or teens that are listening, now is a particular time where people could really socially isolate, right? They're not the ones doing the grocery shopping. They're not particularly into exercise or being outside. And so for individuals in that category who also struggle with social anxiety, I think it's really important right now to talk openly about how are we going to help you, or how are we going to help you help yourself stay motivated during this time. Oh, and another distress tolerance exposure that I was thinking about was calling restaurants, calling grocery stores, calling any place that is open, and either asking very basic questions like what are your hours? Are you delivering? And then if you want to work up your hierarchy a little bit, you could try to ask them how they're doing, or how things have been going at the store during COVID, this COVID-19 time. So that's all.
Yeah, that's a great idea. Thank you for saying that.